China and the United States are on a colliding train. Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues facing life and society. My name is Crispin, and today I'm going to talk about the most recent developments between China and the United States and how we have reached a phase of the new Cold War that is characterized by open and public hostility. Back in the early 90s and beyond, when China was really opening up to the world, when the Soviet Union had collapsed and we had reached that unipolar American moment, the end of history stuff where the belief was that liberal Western democracy would spread unfettered across the world. Well, the wall-to-wall policy towards China was one of engagement, the idea that you would create a rich middle class as they opened up to the rest of the world, exposed to foreign ideas. These increasingly wealthy, educated people would demand new political freedom to go along with their economic freedom, and that would lead to liberal reforms in China, which the West and Americans in particular thought was inevitable because they would seek to modernize and industrialize their economies. And at that time, the Washington consensus was that in order to reach a certain income level, you needed democracy because you needed to have open and accountable institutions, you need to lower the levels of corruption, and you need to encourage the free movement of capital across borders. As we all know, terrible idea. The first thing that China has proved beyond any doubt at all is that there does not need to be a political liberalization in order to have a modern growing market economy. There were some examples of this previously. I think Singapore was a good one. But China has demonstrated that on an industrial scale. And now everybody is aware that China's growth is for China and that China's objective is to reshape the global order in a means that and an outcome that's beneficial to its autocratic totalitarian system, and that no matter how much we choose to trade and engage or invest with China, that China will continue to go down this existing path. So that's the intellectual journey that the United States has been on and the rest of the world since that early 90s sort of period. Nowadays, we have reached a new point where there was a major summit held the other day in Alaska, where a top-level Chinese delegation sat down with Secretary Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, and they had a extremely terse exchange right across the table in public, in front of the world stage, and I have never quite seen anything like it. This was the first such meeting between top Chinese leaders and the Biden administration, and thus it really does set the tone, I think, for the next period of time. Now, we had already, of course, reached this point, but I do want to kind of articulate how this transition has occurred and the similarities and differences between the United States and the Soviet Union. So, as I said, we started with this period of hope and engagement and glory for the new kind of world order that we thought might happen with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the triumph of Western liberal democracy, so-called, that China's growth would inevitably involve it to be a responsible stakeholder in the international system, like Robert Zoellick famously stated. And then there was a period in which there was a sort of a disillusionment. I think it began sort of before Xi Jinping came to power, round about the time of the 2008 Beijing Olympics. People started to see that China was becoming extraordinarily rich and powerful without at the same time assuming the commensurate responsibilities of a superpower on the world stage, still sort of claiming all the economic privileges of being, Zimbabwe or Zambia, and not, a global superpower. So people were starting to have rumblings about that time. But China was still very much saying, look, peaceful rise, domestic problems, low per capita earnings, huge issues of alleviating poverty. That's our focus. We're not, trying to antagonize anybody. And they were kind of semi-successful in that way. And then, of course, after the GFC, the global financial crisis, which America and Europe handled so poorly by comparison to China, which really stimulated the economy in effective ways, that coinciding, shortly after with the rise of Xi Jinping, who wanted to jettison all this peaceful rice stuff in favor of a very aggressive, assertive policy, crushing Hong Kong, bringing it to heel, expanding and militarizing islands in the South China Sea completely against all of its assurances. Obviously suppression of rights in the Uyghur communities, and also increasing threats to Taiwan. China became much more assertive. But even then, the language in the United States was one that was highly calibrated. There's still a group of people that thought that China could democratize and modernize over time, that they hadn't abandoned that philosophy. There was a group of people that were business interests that, of course, still very much exist, but were very pro-China. They saw just the dollar signs in their eyes looking at the growing massive Chinese market. China became heavily integrated in the rest of the world's economy supply chain, so there was a codependency there. The US, federal public debt was growing, and the biggest purchaser seemed to be China, so there was a codependency there. And thus, there was this sort of, yes, we have these issues of industrial theft and cyber attacks and so on, but at the same time, we acknowledge the miracle of the Chinese economy, how difficult it's been to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And we see China as a competitor, but not one that's a real threat to American leadership or someone that can seriously challenge our order. The conversation was like, we want to encourage the things that are about China that we like, and we want to discourage the things and behaviors that we dislike. It was a sort of a calibrated, not a threat. Frenemy was kind of the word that the Taiwanese like to throw around between the US and China, relationship. Then with the Trump years, that I think was jettisoned, and Trump ultimately, after an initial period of like mutual respect with Xi Jinping, quickly said what he'd been saying for decades before that, which is China is the main geopolitical rival of the United States. China seeks to replace the United States as the Middle Kingdom re-emerging on the world stage. Of course, my book talks about this a lot. It's coming out in the next period of time, hopefully. And the clear reorientation of the entire Washington establishment away from the Middle East, away from Europe, to focusing laser-like on the peer competitor, the greatest challenge America has ever faced, an economy that's going to reach its own, which is not seen since it eclipsed the British Empire in the 19th century, as well as 20% of the world's population. So this is a real challenge for Trump and the way he saw his sort of trade wars and everything. And then we saw a landmark speech by the Vice President, Mike Pence, in sort of October of 2019, I think, where he basically laid out that China is the new Soviet Union as far as the Trump administration is concerned, in terms of the generations-long strategic competition between those great rivals. And then there was a major series of coordinated addresses by senior Trump officials, the FBI director, the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and so on. And I've reviewed those in previous videos that sort of laid out the challenge in a multi-vectored way to kind of say, look, going forward, the United States and China are now enemies. When Biden was elected, Biden immediately tried to cool down that language. And Biden has been saying for many years that China isn't really a threat to the United States, and that the hostility towards China is massively overblown, and that China has done a lot of good things. Of course, his son Hunter Biden made millions of dollars out of China. I'm sure that's completely unrelated. And Biden came in with a sense that he was going to normalize to a degree the discourse between China and the United States, in the sense that the United States would go back to this sort of frenemy language of like, there are things that we like about China and there are things that we dislike about China. The dialogue, thus, at Alaska was highly surprising. Now, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, did make the point that says, look, we don't seek an adversarial relationship with China. What we have are some concerns in specific areas. So in a sense, I think what the United States was trying to do, the US side was trying to do, was to go back to naming those things that it found difficult and problematic in the relationship, while also speaking to the things that they thought were potentially positive. But the way in which they said it in this public stage to a group of people who had come a long way to Alaska to be at this summit, the Chinese side saw this as a humiliation and they responded viscerally. Now, if you read the transcript, which is a long transcript of what was said on both sides, you kind of imagine a situation where the Americans acquit themselves well, calling out, the trampling of the rights in Hong Kong, what's happening with the Uyghurs and so on, and not backing down from Chinese critics, pushing back where necessary. If you read the transcript, it reads well. If you watch the videos, however, it's quite clear that the Chinese were having none of it, and they absolutely gutted Secretary Blinken. I mean, there were totally different wavelengths in terms of how skilled the Chinese were at cutting the American diplomats down to size. And that's another amazing thing about previous history, is that once upon a time, Chinese diplomats were apparatchiks who were not diplomats really. They were sent there because of their party loyalty, and would spend their time just repeating, Maoist talking points and then being quiet and not saying anything at all, right? They were just rigid. They were kind of like the way North Korean diplomats are today, terrified of saying anything out of line, just focusing on what they're being told to say and nothing else. Whereas Chinese diplomats today are highly professionalized and able to defend their country on the world stage, even against the highest American officials, off the cuff, on television in a pretty brutal way. So as much as I think that China has a terrible totalitarian dictatorship and it is the enemy of our age, credit where credit is due. Their public servants, their senior diplomats are serving their country and doing it justice. And they're not embarrassing themselves in the way that I think Secretary Blinken did. But having said that, the main theme of this is that it did draw the battle lines, right? That for the first time, the United States and China are willing to get into a room together and just have a massive fisticuff in terms of where they sit in terms of great superpower relations as a new set of adversaries in a Cold War. And it really does reflect in my mind the transition that occurred with the United States and the Soviet Union during the 40s. So, of course, people were very suspicious of the Soviet Union right through the 20s and 30s. And, the rise of communism, they felt that the post-World War I Germany was at risk of falling to communism. They had a lot of communist threat pre-World War II. But then during World War II, of course, they became allies when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa of 1941. And there was hope that as brothers in arms, the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States could really work itself out. And some of the personal relationships were quite profound. Ike Eisenhower, the leader of the Normandy invasion, later president of the United States, had a strong and lifelong affinity for General Zhukov, the leader of the Soviet armed forces. And if General Zhukov was allowed to have a more prominent political role in the post-war era, because Stalin sort of kept him at arm's length for a while there until Stalin passed away, Zhukov and Ike, I think, had a mutual trust and respect to the point where a lot of problems could have been solved. But that wasn't to be. Even before the war ended, there was a lot of distrust and animosity between the two sides. They had a big race to capture territory, in the Second World War. When Berlin was carved up, of course, the famous Berlin airlift in 1947, where Stalin tried to force the Western Allies out of West Berlin, the Korean War, with the North invaded the South. Like, by that stage, we were headlong into the Cold War. And of course, the fact that the United States significantly demilitarized after the war, whereas the Soviets did not, which is one of the reasons why the United States built up so many nuclear weapons as like compensation. That's another story. And so things kind of spiraled out of control. But we can see that the movement in language between praising Stalin and the Soviets as they're fighting for their country against fascism to evil empire. And as Churchill famously said, if Hitler had invaded hell, I would have praised Satan in the House of Commons. So we can see the great transition, and we've seen that today. We are now fully in a Cold War between the United States and China. The US officials and the Chinese officials at the most senior levels are willing to say that openly to each other in the same place before the world stage. That is a new development and something we have not seen before. I think really does mark the generations-long struggle between these two superpowers. That's my view. Please leave your comments down below. Did you read the transcript? I'll leave a link in the description below. The transcript reads fine. Videos, not so much. And let me know your thoughts on that. Have I overstated the case? Was this just one, meeting that the next meeting is going to be fine, it's all going to blow over? Was this just a lot of posturing for domestic audiences or for Biden to shore up his national security credentials, I guess, as a new administration, Democratic administration? Or is this, as I've described? It's a matter of opinion. Please let me know below. If you found value in this, like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.